Minimum wage can be a difficult issue to discuss. There are diverse opinions throughout our industry, across our nation, and certainly within Congress on what minimum wage policy should be. While there are a broad array of thoughts on the issue, most people recognize that there's room for a responsible increase to the federal minimum wage, which has remained at $7.25 since 2009. So while there's momentum for this increase, our goal is really twofold. The first is to reinforce with these policymakers that when talks around this occur, our industry, which is the second largest private sector employer in the nation, we deserve a seat at the table. We deserve the opportunity to shape the legislation into something that's actually workable.
I hope that as they are getting ready to make these big decisions that impact business, that they think about our hospitality business and how we have a very different niche, and we're affected differently than a big, corporate factory would be, for example. So I hope that they take the time to listen to us as owners and as our staff, as workers, and get their opinions and get their experiences and really get the big picture.
Our second goal throughout this process is to educate them on what those pitfalls are. So for instance, the Raise the Wage Act would eliminate a separate tip wage. So you would have to pay your servers the full $15 an hour.
I feel that this issue with the wage will just continue to resurface until the powers that be can identify these two wage models as separate models. It doesn't seem accurate to try to put these two together and come up with one solution when they're so different. So I feel Congress really need to just dissect this and just really identify this industry for what it is, its own unique wage model that deserves its own unique attention.
To be very honest, if they did something with the tip credit, took that away from us, it could be disastrous for our industry. The tipped wage that is disclosed, the lower wage, looks deceiving, it looks low. However, when you put the tips on top of it, I think most people who have those job positions would prefer to stay like that. They're making very good money at the end of the day. And that credit for restaurants is vital for us to be able to survive.
Our servers make more being tipped than they would if I paid them $15 or even $20 an hour.
This is your opportunity. This is your chance to tell your story and to explain why servers prefer tips over a higher minimum wage, because they actually earn more in tips. And this is why throughout the country, when there's been efforts to change the system, the servers themselves were the ones who pushed back.
This is my economy. This is how I make my money. This is what I know. It's kind of all I've known. And we just can't absorb this change. It would really change everything. And these service workers, these skilled workers would be out of the industry. And even with the new negotiations and $15 an hour, that's still a tremendous drop in pay for me. I've been doing this for 23 years. I've perfected my skills. I determine my own wage. So for someone else to determine that wage for me, and in some cases, I can make 3 times that on a weekend night. It would be fatal to my career, and I would have to find a different career.
We hope you will deliver the message that our industry does not have a blanket opposition to increasing the federal minimum wage, but we deserve a seat at the table, and for policymakers to consider responsible ways to increase wages in manners that avoid pitfalls like those that are contained within the Raise the Wage Act.
I don't think it's right to include this industry when it's got such a unique and effective wage system, not only for myself, but for my employer and for the guests, because it's got to work for us all, and it does.
Momentum to increase the federal minimum wage continues to build, with members on the left like Bernie Sanders and on the right like Tom Cotton proposing their own solutions. This past week alone, the 8 Democratic senators who we worked very closely with to successfully keep the Raise the Wage Act from being included in the most recent COVID relief bill, those senators met with members of their leadership to discuss if there's a pathway forward for them. And also in this past week, Republican Mitt Romney and Democrat Kyrsten Sinema began collaborating on a bipartisan proposal that they could share with 20 Republican and Democratic senators to see if that group could also have a pathway forward. So momentum certainly continues to grow. Our goal, as mentioned in the video, is to inform policymakers that we do not have a blanket opposition to any increase in the minimum wage. But we need it to be done in a reasonable and responsible manner that avoids the pitfalls of the Raise the Wage Act. While there are numerous sub-issues that are being discussed, the top two aspects that are being discussed on the Hill are how far to increase the federal minimum wage and the tip wage. So let's take the first issue, the federal minimum wage rate. The spectrum of conversation ranges from $7.25, where it's currently at, all the way up to $15 an hour, which is what's being proposed in the Raise the Wage Act. Senator Manchin, for instance, has a more reasonable and responsible approach compared to the $15 an hour. His approach would be to increase the minimum wage to $11 an hour, and he would not have any of the increases to get there take place until after the pandemic is officially declared over, and then he would do it over a 2 or 3 year time period. Now, here's your opportunity to educate policymakers on why the Raise the Wage Act, which would have a 100% increase to the minimum wage over a very short period of time beginning in the pandemic, doesn't work for you, and why a more reasoned and responsible approach would. The second major issue is the tip wage. The tip wage of $2.13 is currently set at approximately 30% of the federal minimum wage. There's been conversations about where to set the tip wage. And as the minimum wage increases, the question is, how far does the tip wage go up? Does it go up, stay where it is, which is 30%? Does it go up to 40% of the minimum wage, 50%? And if you're Bernie Sanders and several others with the Raise the Wage Act, you would actually eliminate the tip wage, 100%, going all the way up to the full level of $15 an hour. So here's your opportunity to defend a tip wage and our nation's tipping system, to explain that while there can be a modest and meaningful increase, the current system actually works. It works for employers, and explain why, and describe why it works and what the importance of it is. It works for customers who prefer the tipping method. But most importantly, it works for the employees themselves. It's the employees, as we know, who time and time again across our nation, every time there's been any effort to try to diminish or harm the tipping system, it's been them who have pushed back, because they recognize that they are better off with the tipping system that's currently in place than a higher base wage and a reduction in either their tip wages or an elimination of their tips. So we appreciate your participation to help to educate policymakers on these critical issues. Thank you for participating in this process, and we welcome any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Matt. A quick programming note. Apologies for the technology glitch. We here at the National Restaurant Association have a newfound appreciation for folks that do live TV. We're going to take the break out of the break period that we have scheduled. So as you look at the rest of the agenda, we'll still be starting everything else on time. Matt, it won't surprise you that we've got a lot of questions in the queue. First one's really on the tip wage. The notion that we're getting from a lot of operators is, why does Congress need to raise the tip wage if every tip server is guaranteed the minimum wage? If the minimum wage goes to $10, $11, $15, that's how much that tipped employee is going to get. Why are we even having conversations with anyone about raising the tip wage?
Certainly. So the answer to that is a difficult one for people to hear. And particularly, I can tell you that from my personal experience, it's very frustrating. And that's because I worked for the Senate for over 13 years. Over a decade of that was spent on the Senate Small Business Committee, where I was really steeped in policy. And anyone who really cares about policy, understands policy, gets frustrated when politics wins out over policy. Unfortunately, this is one of those instances. It's not about the policy. It's just not. It's about the politics of the issue and the optics. The reality is that the federal tip wage of $2.13 has not increased since 1991. And the politics of the optics of keeping it at that level are very difficult. And so the wins are certainly erring on the side of moving it forward.
Another question we're getting, Matt, a lot of folks are a little flabbergasted as to if the Raise the Wage Act is likely dead. It certainly looks that way. Why are we having this conversation? So what is the impetus for another round of a minimum wage increase if we already have Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, 9 other Democrats on the record saying they're against the Raise the Wage Act?
Right. So the answer to that question is that the momentum does indeed continue to grow. Look, this is a top tier issue amongst the Democratic caucus, and it's from the president all the way down. The Raise the Wage Act is already passed in the House. And in the Senate, yes, we were very successful at keeping the Raise the Wage Act out of the last COVID relief bill, working very closely with the Democratic senators who opposed it. But to be very clear, those Democratic senators, as well as many Senate Republican senators as well, in our conversations, they are in favor of increasing the federal minimum wage. Like most people, they understand that the $7.25 wage that's been in place since 2009, that there is room for growth. Where they agreed with us is that the Raise the Wage Act itself was the wrong response to do so, and that there is a more reasonable and responsible way. So the issue is not going away. They're going to continue to look at this issue and push it forward, and we need to be at the table to try to help shape it in the process.
Matt, there are a lot, it's almost a hodgepodge of wage issues, aspects that are being talked about. It's not just what's the cash wage, what's the tip credit. What are some of the other issues, priorities rather, that the National Restaurant Association is focusing on in any discussion that we have on minimum wage with lawmakers?
There are numerous issues with the wage that go across a broad spectrum. So, one issue that we've talked about obviously is what wage rates themselves should we set? Another question is, when does the first wage rate increase? Does it happen in the middle of the pandemic or thereafter? What is the phase-in period? Over what period of time, and how many increases along the way? There's issues around indexing, and if you index and how you index. One of the most important issues as well in terms of sub-issues would be the youth wage. The youth wage is currently set at $4.25, and there are efforts to increase it. Tom Cotton's bill would increase it to $6 an hour over a 5-year period, which would be a more reasonable increase than what's being proposed in the Raise the Wage Act. The Raise the Wage Act would completely eliminate the youth wage altogether. Now, for those of us in our industry that have worked there, including myself and others, you may know that half of all adults have worked in our industry at one point in their life. So if you move the youth wage all the way up to $15 an hour, in my mind, that's a recipe for failure in terms of the disability and the perverse disincentive against giving opportunities to youth and others to get job experience that they critically need.
Matt, there's a handful of states, as you know, that do not have a tip credit. They haven't for a while now. As the federal minimum wage may be changed, is there any special? The word here is dispensation. I get the word. I get what they're thinking here. But is there any unique aspect of a change in the minimum wage that would apply to that limited number of states that don't have a tip credit? Is that being discussed?
So there is not a lot of discussions around actually doing so, and the reason why is I believe it's 7 states now that don't have a separate tip wage. The reality is the federal government is very, very, and I should say policymakers in Congress are opposed to the idea of trying to preempt states. And this is both a Democratic issue. Several Democrats want to give states the flexibility to increase wages above what the federal level would be. But it's also a Republican issue because for a lot of Republicans, they not only in the minimum wage space, but in others, they're very big on state rights. And so there is an uninterest in trying to go to the states and say, we're going to try to limit your ability to do so.
Matt, as far as if a minimum wage increase was implemented by policymakers, what kind of mitigating factors, what kind of pillow can restaurants land on to make it at least a softer impact, particularly during a pandemic? What are we advocating for? What do you think the likelihood of something like that being phased in would be?
Right. So there are a lot of mitigation factors, and they go across a broad spectrum, right? So one of them, obviously, is, as I mentioned earlier, is when do these increases take place? Again, for a lot of people, doing so in the middle of a pandemic is just a really terrible idea. You're looking at an industry where 110,000 restaurant stores are closed. We're nearly 2 million employees less than where we were pre-pandemic. And the last thing that you need is a move like the Raise the Wage Act, which the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office has said would result in up to 2.7 million jobs lost. So one of the biggest factors is when does it first take place? How long can it be spread out? Can it be spread out over a longer period of time? There's questions also around things like tax incentives and others that might be in there to be able to mitigate some of these effects. But when I mention stuff like that, I want to be very careful because it's not lost on us that most of the things that were proposed or may be proposed in terms of mitigating factors like on the tax side are unlikely to be high enough to offset the steep increase in labor costs. And of course, labor costs are among the highest costs of our industry. It's second only to food costs. And so while we're having conversations around these mitigating factors, we're also being very clear with policymakers that what matters the most is getting the numbers and the timing and the phase-in and pieces like that right, because the other pieces will not offset it in and of themselves.
Matt, There has been, as you know, that a lot of the Republican establishment has had strong concerns with the Raise the Wage Act or any minimum wage increase that they feel is too high. There's been a lot of talk in Washington as to what's the future of the filibuster going to be. Does that apply in? We don't have to go deep on legislative procedure here, but what if Chuck Schumer decides to eliminate the filibuster and allow things to be passed by just a 50 vote or 50+1 vote majority? How does that change the dynamic as far as a minimum wage debate in the months to come?
That's a good question. Look, the threat of the elimination of the filibuster is very real, and it would have dire consequences for our industry. I'm a Senate, longtime person working in the Senate who believes in the institution and the importance and the value of the filibuster, because I do believe that it allows for more consensus and more working across the aisle on issues. If the filibuster was eliminated, if it were eliminated today, fortunately, at least now, we have several senators, the 8 senators who worked with us in opposing the Raise the Wage Act, who would hopefully stand up and say, look, although we could pass this in an existing form, we don't want to do so because we have concerns with several of the aspects, and we would work with them to highlight those aspects and to mitigate the bill and get it to something that's workable. But clearly, the threat of losing the filibuster in future years, particularly if there's a change in addition of seats, and that diminishes the role. It continues to remind people of how important it is to address this issue now, upfront while we can, and we can shape it in a positive way.
Matt, you mentioned that this is not just a Bernie Sanders discussion anymore. There are a number of moderate Democrats who are talking about increases in the minimum wage. There are even some, dare I say, rock-ribbed Republicans who are talking about it as well. You've mentioned Senator Manchin and the moderate approach. We know the Raise the Wage Act favored by the left. Tell us about some of the things that the Republicans, how they would approach a minimum wage, particularly on the corporate side.
Sure. So the legislation that was introduced by Tom Cotton, Mitt Romney, and there are other Republican senators that are on the bill as well, would also increase the minimum wage of $7.25. Their approach, though, would be to expand it to $10 an hour, and over a more extended period of time. So it's over a 5-year period. It would get to the $10 over a longer period in time frame. They also have allowances for small businesses as opposed to larger businesses. So there would be a very slower phase in for the small businesses. And I spoke inartfully. When I say a very smaller phase in, I meant to say it would phase in, but just over a slightly longer period of time. And all of these proposals that we've seen out there would have indexing after you hit their final wage rate, rather if it be $15 an hour under what Bernie Sanders has approached, $11 an hour, what Manchin has talked about, or $10 an hour under the Republican approach.
Matt, we have done, the National Restaurant Association has done grassroots campaigns in the past, channeling the voice of the restaurant industry to electeds with their concerns on the minimum wage and the Raise the Wage Act. Is there any current grassroots play that you see coming anytime soon as it relates to the tip wage, or do we wait more until we've got a stronger semblance of a package in front of us?
So I would say, first and foremost, look, what we're doing in this public affairs conference in terms of grassroots is absolutely critical, because it will help you to educate policymakers here and now while these conversations are taking place. Obviously, we need to do so as well on an ongoing basis as things continue to move forward. The key to this, in my mind, is I myself work advocating in DC and work talking to policymakers day in and day out about these issues. But to be honest, I don't kid myself. I know and I recognize very well that the best voices for our industry are the operators themselves and the employees themselves. It's you. It's the people that can go up to policymakers and tell your story and explain what this means for you and explain the negative consequences if they get this wrong. Not only the 2.7 million jobs that the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office said would be lost if you went to the Raise the Wage Act, but very specifically, talk about what this means for you. What do you pay your employees? Why are they better off with a tip wage? What happens if you lose that tip wage? Do you need to increase your menu prices, eliminate job opportunities, take away hours that people want, all of the above, additional measures? They need to hear from you in reality and in your terms, talking about why this matters and why the tipping system currently in place works, as well as for those on the wage issue in general.
Last question for you, Matt, is if there is a minimum wage increase, I assume that it would clear the House. So it's really always going to be a question of the Senate being a bit of a fallback measure. Would it be in a freestanding, would there be a straight up or down vote on a minimum wage increase? Will it be put into an omnibus, hippo-sized piece of legislation? What's the legislative vehicle going to look like if this comes to pass?
Well, one aspect that we were very fortunate of, and we worked very closely throughout this process, is that when you think about reconciliation, and that is the bill that the most recent COVID relief bill was passed in, it's an expedited process in the Senate whereby you can move certain pieces of legislation with a simple 51 vote threshold. And you only get a few bites of the apple to do this. There's only 2 or 3 opportunities throughout this particular presidential administration in these 4 years to do that, although there's been some recent efforts to suggest that there could be more. Now, where we've been fortunate is that the Senate parliamentarian has said that this particular piece, raising the minimum wage, cannot be included in that type of a bill because it does not meet the procedural requirements to do so. But there are other ways that it could be done. It could be done by an amendment at any point. Remember, in the Senate, nothing has to be relevant or germane usually on the floor. So at any point, if a bill came to the floor and there was an amendment to have broad bipartisan consensus and get 60, it could pass.
Matt Walker, a lot of moving pieces as it relates to the future of wage, our engagement on a reasonable one. Appreciate you breaking it all down for us. Thanks.
Thank you.